Hello, I'm Ben Toomey, independent candidate to be Warwickshire's next Police and Crime Commissioner. I'm joined today by Neil Woods. Neil, would you like to introduce yourself for the camera?
Yes, as you say, I'm Neil Woods. I'm from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. I was in the police for 23 years, and for 14 years of that I spent much of the time working undercover, primarily with drugs operations.
So really you were a soldier in the war on drugs, and the question I'd like to ask you is, who are we fighting in that war?
Yes, I suppose you could call me a soldier in the war on drugs. When I started working in the police, I believed that if someone got into any kind of difficulty with drugs, if they had a problem with addiction, then it was their own fault for trying the drugs in the first place, and a failure of willpower to get out of the situation. But you work with problematic drug users long enough, and you sort of empathy shows you a different way, really. And so in this war on drugs, the people who are warred against, so to speak, are those vulnerable people who have got some difficulties with drugs. They are the people who are trampled underfoot in this war. I mean, we talk about organised crime being the enemy in the war on drugs, but organised crime are a product of the war, not the beginning point of the enemy, so to speak.
So if the war on drugs is a war against those in addiction or those suffering from addiction, then how do we get around that? How do we start to break the stigma of those suffering from addiction, where they're called junkies or addicts or whatever else?
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's all sorts of slang terms that people use, and people just tend to look down on people who have got problematic drug use. But if you take heroin, for example, and if you speak to any person, any drug counsellor who's been in the trade for a good few years, they will tell you similar statistics to this, that 2/3 of problematic heroin users are self-medicating for childhood trauma, either childhood sexual abuse or childhood physical abuse. A full 2/3 of them. Many of the rest of them, problematic users, are self-medicating for other reasons. So by criminalising those people, it's cruelty. It's pure cruelty, because these are people who need help.
Mm-hmm.
And not only does the law seek to prosecute them for their behaviour, alongside that is all the stigma that goes with it, and the way that individuals treat them and society treats them as a whole.
Yeah. In terms of my campaign, I've got another manifesto point aside from drug policy, where I'm pushing for evidence-based policy. So the evidence in terms of drug policy, I find, is something often missing, and it's an area I really want to improve upon. Just to look at where it's failed is kind of very easy. So people in their 20s and 30s, nearly 1 in 7 deaths of people in that age group in Britain is from drug poisoning. And that's one of the real problems, where we end up with a situation where evidence here suggests that you're 20 times more likely to die from a drug overdose than you are in Portugal, where they have a whole different type of evidence. Do you want to share some of that international?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, you mentioned Portugal, and the reason they now have a progressive drug policy nationally is because as politicians they decided to follow evidence. They actually set up a group, and they said, well, look, we have got a dreadful situation here. We've got the highest overdose rate in Europe. We've got highest HIV rates. It was a dreadful situation, and they improved it by saying to a group of experts, provide us with the evidence of what will work, and we will follow it wherever that evidence takes us. And so by the politicians actually committing to follow evidence, that's where in the year 2000 they adopted their decriminalisation policy. And now, whereas we have 46 deaths per million population from drugs, they have 3. It's an enormous difference in just 15 years, and there's no one in Portugal wants to go back. There's no political movement to change it back. So, yeah, and as you say, all policy should be evidence based. There's no room for ideology and moralising and pseudoscience in politics.
Yeah.
we should be following evidence.
Yeah.
And now, with drug policy internationally, we are at the stage where the evidence has actually been around for a long time. And, evidence such as Dr. John Marks from the 1980s in the UK, but not just individual experiments, but now there's entire state models who have the proof that we can do so much better.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no excuse for not following evidence.
No, and in terms of that evidence, we've talked about the international, almost the global evidence that's coming out, but there's some much closer to home. There's great work going on here in Britain with people pushing policy and reforming drug policy in new ways. Part of that is County Durham and Darlington, if you'd like to speak a bit about that.
Yes, I mean, obviously, the Police and Crime Commissioner in County Durham, Ron Hogg, well, obviously, you used to work for Ron. Yeah. Him and his chief constable is obviously on board with the reform efforts that they're making. They've made astonishing differences. For example, each constabulary is measured by the Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabularies each year, and they are studied, and they are rated in how well they are doing. It's no accident, I am sure, that Durham is the only county to have reached outstanding. There are several good forces rated good around the country, but they are the only one that's reached outstanding. And the reason for that is because they have put their resources, they have followed evidence, and they have put their resources where they're needed. And I think the most important part of that is that they have stopped the wasteful policing of people for possession or growing or cultivating their own cannabis plants.
Yep.
Because it's an enormous cost of policing. Drugs is the biggest single cost in your policing budget. It's the biggest thing. So if you can reduce that, you literally have more money to spend on things that actually have a social cost.
Yep.
And the proof, as you say, the proof evidence from the UK now is in Durham. I believe, I haven't actually seen the statistics yet, but I believe that shortly there will be some evidence from Durham that cannabis use has not gone up as a result of their progressive policy. Mm-hmm. Now, whereas that doesn't surprise me at all, because from what I've observed and other evidence that is out there, punitive measures have no impact on drug use anyway. Yeah, they have literally no impact.
There's the Home Office report, isn't there, of the comparators internationally, which showed, fairly conclusively towards the end of 2014 that it makes no difference how hard or soft you perceive to be in terms of the number of people actually using. So if you're reducing harm, you've got that body of users that you already have to deal with. So it's about working around that, I think.
Yes, precisely. And that's one of the most important pieces of evidence, actually, that you're quoting there, because it's actually commissioned and came from the Home Office. It was delayed for some time because some politicians really weren't too keen on the findings, but we shouldn't shy away from evidence. We should be embracing evidence. And particularly, the additional evidence that's about to come out from Durham about the success of their policy in regards to cannabis.
Yeah.
And of course, you should resist any suggestion that means that it's a soft policy on drugs, because it's not. It means it's a policy that cares about people, and increasingly, it's becoming clear that you can either care or criminalise, and there's actually no middle ground at all.
Mm-hmm. And in County Durham, it's worth pulling out there's the checkpoint scheme that they have in terms of cannabis users. Do you want to just fill in on that, or?
No, you probably. I mean, I do roughly know about that, but I think it'll better come from you, because you know much more about it than I do.
Okay. I'll go again.
Go on then.
So in County Durham, it's worth pointing out the checkpoint scheme that they have there, which is to do with cannabis users the first time, or low-level possession of drugs offences. The first time you're caught in possession, you will go through the checkpoint scheme, which is kind of like a driver's awareness course, like you do when you're caught speeding. And it just gets away from that criminalisation as the first stage, because you will know more than anyone that once you go down that line of being arrested, being imprisoned, it's just as easy to access drugs in prison, if not easier, than it is when you're actually out in the wider society. So if you stop that criminalisation, especially of school children to begin with, because it is usually young people that are first experimenting with low-level possession and will be caught, if we can get away from that, then it stops a whole load of harms in the future as well.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things about that scheme is the fact that prohibition as it stands doesn't reduce demand, it doesn't impact on anyone's decision to take drugs, but it does prevent them seeking help. So if you have a system where you are not criminalising people, you are then able to identify people who do need help, because some people do.
Yeah.
Drugs can be harmful, but a scheme like that, it opens up the dialogue, and it means that people who do need help, it's a minority, but some do need help. They can get the help that they need.
Mm-hmm. And that help is, but by helping those people, we're benefiting the whole of society, not just in terms of the potential crimes they'd be committing, the organised criminals that they're funding, but also in terms of actual financial, the financial sustainability of the policy. So we've got, where if you invest £1 in drug treatment, it's going to save at least £2.50 down the line, and that's a good investment for any banker really to make.
Absolutely, and there are other aspects to the financial impact of drug policy as well. I mean, I have seen one statistic that suggests each individual that pays tax pays £400 a year just on drug policy, which is an enormous amount of money. And then also the impact of heroin users, for example, they commit 50% of acquisitive crime, heroin and crack cocaine users, and that makes people's house insurance higher and things like that. Yeah. Now, it's a very pragmatic conclusion to come to, that even if you decide that you don't care about those problematic drug users, I would prefer that society did care. But there is also the pragmatic view that if those problematic users had treatment and the money that was spent on prosecuting them was spent on treatment, then you would have an enormous drop in crime. In Switzerland, for example, where they have heroin-assisted therapy, they prescribe heroin to people who are addicted to heroin.
Right.
It's quite a straightforward, well-evidenced, successful policy. They have virtually eliminated street prostitution. They have had enormous drops in acquisitive crime. Shoplifting has disappeared from city centres. These are simple, pragmatic policies which can have an enormous benefit on communities. Yeah.
So drug policy in general, or drugs within society, they are so widespread in the harm that they can cause, or the policy can cause. And what we're seeing here in our society is that we've got over 90,000 prisoners now, and at least 50% of them are in prison for drug-related offences. And yet I'm running in an election to be Police and Crime Commissioner, and the other candidates haven't mentioned the word drugs, as far as I can tell, not even once to state a position. So how can we get it where there's a silence on this topic when it's so important, not just to policing or criminal justice, but to society on the whole?
Exactly. It baffles me as well. It's of all the policing issues, with all the associated harms, the crime that we've just talked about, I mean, there's 50 people dying a week in this country from drug overdoses. 50 a week. That's a lot of grieving families, and the impact that has on and all those family members is enormous. What other policing issue can you actually say that has all that much impact? So I agree, to have silence on this topic and for it to be not at the forefront is incredible. I think a lot of that comes down to a sort of willful ignoring of the evidence. Again, it's we can offer the debate and offer the evidence, but increasingly people who support the status quo are just not coming to the table to debate, because the argument has been won. Our evidence is overwhelming, and we don't seem to have reached that tipping point where people are willing to accept that. So I'm always keen to challenge anyone to debate with us. Come on, this is an issue. This is an issue that affects people. Talk to us about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to finish, with your experience as a police officer, you'll recognise the way that policing work is done from the inside. And Warwickshire Police, their slogan is protecting people from harm. So within drug policy, would you say that they're limited in their ability to do that under the current model?
That's an interesting thought. I didn't know that was the slogan, and that's quite Yeah, quite relevant, isn't it? Yes, the current drug policy prevents that being possible, I would say. That's a big statement, but I think it's true. Drug policy as it is just empowers organised crime. And I think what you'll find as Police and Crime Commissioner is one of your main directives from the Home Office is to try and get a grips with organised crime. It's one of the Home Office priorities. It has been for a few years. I think it will always remain so. And of course, there's always many drives to try and take the money off gangsters, take the money away from organised crime. And there's always a very limited success because it's not actually that difficult to hide money. Just as like it's not that difficult to deal drugs without getting caught. The only way you will ever make our communities safe by taking the power away from organised crime is to take their trade away from them, I would say.
And you're part of an organisation that is made up almost solely of ex-law enforcement. It's Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, my organisation, we have former chief constables, we have former MI5, former Royal Navy, British Army, all people who in one way or another, we have magistrates, all people who in one way or another have been involved in prohibition and propping up prohibition. And we have seen up close and personal the failings of that policy, the corruption that it causes, and the harm to society and individuals. So yes, we are committed. As an international organisation, we're established in 20 countries now. But I can speak for Bleep UK that we are committed to progressive drug policy wherever possible.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.